Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with conflicting rumors of peace between Russia and Ukraine, with Trump claiming we are closer to peace than ever, and the head of the UK's MI6 Foreign Intelligence Service saying Putin will continue to string along the peace process until he gets everything he wants. Joining us to discuss how Ukraine could defend itself without joining NATO, which Zelensky has apparently conceded on, is Jennifer Kavanagh, a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Previously, she was a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Canadian Endowment for International Peace, and she has an article at Defense Priorities we will discuss, an armed non-alignment model for Ukraine's post-war security. Then we'll speak with Karen Greenberg, an international studies fellow at the New America Foundation, a fellow at New York University Law School's Reese Center for Security, and a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. She's the author of Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump, and Our Nation at Risk, Election Integrity as a National Security Issue, co-authored with Julian Zilazar. We will discuss doubts about Putin's interest in peace coming from the new head of the UK's MI6 and how Trump's new national security strategy has rattled Europe. Then finally we'll speak with Henry Giroux, a renowned educator, author and cultural critic who holds a chair for scholarship in the public interest in English and cultural studies at McMaster University in Canada. His recent books include Insurrections, Education in the Age of Counter-Revolutionary Politics, Fascism on Trial, Education and the Possibility of Democracy, and his latest book is The Burden of Conscience, Educating Beyond the Veil of Silence. And we will discuss his recent article at Counterpunch, Higher Education in the Time of Fascist Plague. And before we begin, for over a decade, we have warned that Trump is both a criminal and likely a traitor, not to mention he's mentally unstable, egomaniacal, woefully ignorant, wildly incompetent, insatiably greedy, and corrupt. Now it should be clear to all that his chaotic misrule must be ended as soon as possible, and until that happens, Background Briefing will continue to investigate and expose MAGA criminality and cruelty, but more importantly, explore strategies and popular movements to bring about regime change as quickly as possible to restore democracy and civility and stop the systematic destruction of the United States at home and its standing abroad. To help sustain us with public broadcasting and freedom of the press itself under assault as Trump's billionaire buddies buy up the mainstream media, you can make a tax-deductible donation to our nonprofit foundation, the Public Truth Media Foundation, at publictruthmedia.org or at backgroundbriefing.org/donate. And thank you. And joining us now is Jennifer Kavanagh, who's a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Previously, she was a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Canadian Endowment for International Peace, and also worked as a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation, and has an article at Defense Priorities, an armed non-alignment model for Ukraine's post-war security. Welcome to Background Briefing, Jennifer Kavanagh.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And in the talks going on in Berlin, hosted by German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, apparently Vladimir Zelensky, who is negotiating with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, has said that Ukraine is willing to drop its ambitions to join NATO. This has led Trump to suggest that we're closer than ever to peace. It also has Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, saying we are seeing real and concrete progress. That progress is made possible thanks to the alignment between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States. It seems that the Polish Prime Minister Tusk is a little skeptical, and there's a great deal of skepticism coming from the head of Britain's MI6 Foreign Intelligence Service. And she's saying that Putin will continue to string along the peace process until he gets everything he wants. So let's start with the breakthrough, if you will, of Ukraine being willing to drop its ambitions to join NATO and its need for a defense force, short of boots on the ground from NATO countries, which Putin rules out. So I take it, Jennifer, you got the answers, right?
Well, I have a proposal. I mean, I agree that NATO membership is not in the cards for Ukraine at this time. That's not only because Russia has made it a red line and a demand for ending this war, but also because it simply wouldn't be credible for NATO members now to extend an Article 5 commitment that would put them on the hook for sending troops to Ukraine if there were to be future aggression, for the simple reason that they have not done so in the past. The United States and European countries have multiple times now refused to send forces to defend Ukraine in 2014 and again in 2022. So to say now that they would do so in the future is not credible, and in fact would really undermine Article 5 writ large, and pose a serious threat to the continuance of NATO alliance. So it's not clear that it's in anyone's interests.
Well, on the Russian side, the Deputy Foreign Minister Rybakov is saying that Russia is not going to give up on its demands that Ukraine hand over parts of the Donbass it hasn't conquered, and that they will not accept the presence of NATO country troops in Ukraine. So how do the Europeans basically step up with some boots on the ground? There's the promise that 30 countries will join what they call the coalition of the willing. But how do you finesse that? In other words, it's not NATO, but it's European troops.
Well, I guess I don't really see a way to finesse it. I don't think it's going to happen. First of all, there's been talk of the coalition of the willing now for about 9 months, and it's not really clear to me who's in this coalition and what they're willing to do. They seem to be able to raise maybe 5,000, maybe 10,000 forces. I'm not sure what that does to help deter Russia in the future. They've made it clear that they can't deploy into Ukraine without a U.S. backstop. It's not clear that the United States would provide that backstop, or what that backstop would even include. And as you noted, Russia has ruled this out. They've said that there will be no NATO member country forces inside Ukraine. And right now they have the battlefield advantage, so they do have some ability to dictate the terms. It's not clear to me why Europe thinks this is a viable option. There's been talk that there's an expectation that President Trump can convince President Putin to accept this. But Russia has fought for 4 years to avoid just this outcome of having a Ukraine that is tied in a meaningful way, meaning boots on the ground or institutional defense commitment through NATO membership to the West. So why would they stop now and accept the exact thing that they've been fighting for 4 years to prevent? It doesn't make sense to me.
So what does make sense then? Because you're arguing, I take it, Jennifer, that there's a way for Ukraine to defend itself.
That's my argument and what my analysis shows. So the model that I lay out, which I call armed non-alignment, would have Ukraine outside of military alliances. That's the non-alignment piece. But it wouldn't rule out defense cooperation on a bilateral basis or the integration of Ukraine's defense industrial base with Western countries. Ukraine could still train with European countries inside of Europe, just as long as it was outside of NATO. So Ukraine would not be alone, as some people would suggest. And it would be armed to defend itself with a porcupine strategy, which just means that it would be defensively focused to make the costs of future invasion simply too high for Russia to find palatable or worthwhile. My assessment is that Ukraine could raise a military of about 250 to 300,000 people as an active duty peacetime force and probably can't sustain a military larger than that, but that's probably enough given changes in warfare that we've seen over the past few years to defend the country's borders. And its own defense industrial base can produce most of the things it needs, including artillery, some types of ammunition, drones, armored vehicles, and it would need some defense support from the West, including especially air defense interceptors, and some longer range munitions. I'm not talking ATACMs or munitions that can go further than, say, 100 kilometers, but some of the artillery rockets that they've relied on for their defense, and that this aid could be provided for a reasonable cost over a period of about 5 years. And within that 5-year window, Russia would also be reconstituting. So at the end of it, Ukraine would have a really robust defense industrial base and defense force that would be capable of defending itself in the future without uh, promises of um, direct military intervention from NATO member countries or European boots on the ground.
So, an American official at these talks in Berlin, who spoke to reporters on conditions of anonymity, said that the document that Zelensky apparently has agreed on with Witkoff and Jared Kushner is very specific about how to deter further incursions and punish Russia if they occur, and that includes false flag operations. So, what do we know about that, and how solid are those guarantees?
Well, I don't think we know very much at all about what's in that document or what types of guarantees are included. And in fact, in remarks that senior administration officials made to the press, it seemed like a lot of the details were still to be determined in future discussions and technical talks. So it's not really clear what exactly is included in any kind of security guarantee package. But I would just underscore that any commitment to send US military or European military forces into Ukraine in the event of future aggression is just simply not credible. They haven't done it in the past, and there's no reason to believe they would do so in the future, even with a treaty commitment. Just looking at the United States, historically, the United States has been very willing to send military forces to defend its interests, regardless of whether there's a treaty or not. There was no treaty with Kuwait when the United States sent forces to try to drive back Iraqi invaders. There was no treaty with South Korea when the United States sent forces there in 1950. There is no treaty commitment needed. The fact that the United States has not intervened suggests that leaders in both parties assess that this is not in US vital interests, and for Europe, it's the same. So, if we're talking about what types of security guarantees are likely or would be credible, it would be things that the US and Europe have already done. Provision of peacetime military aid and surge aid in the case of war. They could commit to create strategic stockpiles outside of Ukraine of long-range weapons and air defense interceptors that Ukraine would get in the event of future aggression. But that's the sort of security guarantee that would be credible and actually useful to Ukraine in the future.
So, how much then is the release of the frozen Russian funds? The Belgians have been holding them up, and apparently the EU has found a way around it. And I think there's about 220, 230 billion euros involved. Has that moved things along? And would that money be used to buy the weaponry that Ukraine needs?
Well, I think there are two considerations. The first is the near-term consideration that Ukraine needs Europe to mobilize some financing if it's going to make its budget um, that to balance its budget going forward. I mean, right now, Europe is paying for 40 to 60% of Ukraine's budget. So if they don't mobilize some kind of financing, Ukraine faces a significant budget hole and they don't really have a plan B. Um, that could be what they're calling a reparations loan, which would be a loan based on these Russian assets. So that's sort of the near-term consideration, whether or not they're able to do that or whether they find some other type of financing to help Ukraine in the near term. In the longer term, I think the expectation is that these assets would be mobilized to support Ukraine. It could be for reconstruction inside Ukraine, economic development. It could be for financing to help pay for their military buildup. It could go into investments into their defense industrial base, and yes, it could be used to finance weapons purchases from Europe or the United States.
So, what about the 4 million Ukrainians that are refugees? Would they be able to come back? Because they're in a way, they're a burden on European countries like Germany, are they not?
Well, I think the hope is that they will come back once the war ends, but that will depend a little bit on how the war ends. One of the arguments that Ukrainian leaders make about why they need security guarantees and promises of post-war reconstruction and post-war military assistance is to encourage people who have left to come back. People may not feel secure coming back, day one after the ceasefire. So it will be important that the country is seen as stable and secure, that people have the confidence that war won't start again. That's important not only for getting people to come back, people who have left, but also encouraging people who are there now to stay for the long term. It's also important for attracting investors, private companies who might set up headquarters there, or defense contractors who might set up production facilities there. So it really depends on the type of peace that's established and how confident Ukrainians are that it will endure. Part of that will be on Ukraine's own military. The argument of my paper is that Ukraine's own military, its own defense industrial base, is the only sure guarantee that it has. So part of it will depend on that, but yes, it will also depend on the types of external support that Ukraine gets.
Well, Ukraine's developed a pretty advanced military industrial base, has they not? And they seem to have been ahead on drones, although the Russians apparently have caught up with now they're using fiber optic cables so that the drones can't be intercepted. How do you see the alignment of technology between the Russian military industrial base and the Ukrainian military industrial base?
Well, Russia's military industrial base will always be bigger. I will always be able to produce more. I think Ukraine's industrial base, especially, its military industrial base has grown significantly since the start of the war, and I see a large potential for it to continue growing with more financing in the post-war context. Ukraine has proved very adept at technologically innovating and doing so quickly and rapidly. Whether or not they can do so faster than Russia, I think is an open question. At the beginning of the war, they were, now they're not. So I think that's something that's to be determined. But I do have a lot of confidence that Ukraine's defense industrial base will continue to grow, and can be ultimately the key source of most military technologies and um, munitions and hardware that the country needs.
So, just in the last couple of minutes, though, Trump has never exhibited any affection for Ukraine, where he has for Russia and for Putin. He's always asking Ukraine to make sacrifices, and never asking Russia to do anything, as far as I can see. And obviously, he wants his Nobel Peace Prize, and I suspect that he would sell out Ukraine to get it. On the other hand, Putin seems to be stringing him along, which is what the head of the British Foreign Intelligence Services just said yesterday. So, how much is this wishful thinking that's going on here now? If you got Putin, who has this obsession about Kievan Rus and all this weird historical stuff that seems to motivate him, and he thinks he's got the time and he's got the industrial base, and he can wait them out. So, do you really think that there's something really happening here? To talk about a Christmas ceasefire and peace, and I'm sure Trump is already writing his Nobel Peace Prize speech.
Well, I guess I don't have a lot of confidence that there'll be a ceasefire by Christmas. I think one concern I have is that negotiations happening right now actually don't involve Russia at all. The talks are happening between the US, the Ukrainians, and the Europeans. And it's great if those three parties come to an agreement on what they'll accept, but that excludes what Russia will accept. And we can agree that this invasion was unjustified, and that use of force is never the right way to solve security concerns or diplomatic disagreements. But ultimately, if we want a lasting peace, it has to be something that all the parties agree to, including Russia. And I think it's true that Russia is stringing this process out or is not ready yet to settle. They are, in my view, ready to negotiate, even if they're not ready immediately to settle. But the problem here is that, as you suggested, that Trump wants this war to end, and he doesn't really care how it ends. I don't think he wants to throw Ukraine under the bus, because if he wanted to do that, he would have done it already. He does not want to see Ukraine collapse because it looks bad for him politically. So I do think there are limits there. But he doesn't really care about the details. But Putin cares a lot about the details, and he wants a formal process that gets into these details. And there won't really be a peace until those details are addressed. So you have two very different agendas right now, and I think my concern is that there isn't enough attention being paid to the details. That there's a sense that we can kind of agree on these high level principles and that's it, and we can all go home. And actually, that's not how it's going to work. This process will take months, if not longer, to work through all the required details. And the more these high level summits focus on the big points without getting into the nitty gritty details, the longer I think it will take before we see an end to the war. So, I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic that we're moving in the right direction. in the sense that the pace of the talks has increased, and their endurance has increased. The consistency has become greater in terms of how often and how long they're meeting. But it's still not like the right set of processes. And if you're going to end the war, you have to talk to Russia. They can't be excluded from the talks, which seems to be how it's happening right now.
Well, Jennifer Kavanagh, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Jennifer Kavanagh, who's a Senior Fellow and Director of Military Analysis at Defense Priorities, where her research focuses on U.S. military strategy, force structure and defense budgeting, the defense industrial base, and U.S. military deployments and interventions. Previously, she was a Senior Fellow at the American Statecraft Program at the Canadian Endowment for International Peace, and she has an article at Defense Priorities, an armed non-alignment model for Ukraine's post-war security. We're going to take a brief station break, back discussing doubts about Putin's interest in peace coming from the new head of the UK's MI6 and how Trump's new national security strategy has rattled Europe.
Then someone says you're in the wrong place, my friend. You'd better leave. And the only sound that's left after the ambulances go is Cinderella sweeping up on Desolation Road.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Karen Greenberg, an International Studies Fellow at the New America Foundation and a Fellow at the New York University Law School's Reese Center for Security, and a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. She's the author of The Least Worst Place, Guantanamo's First 100 Days, and Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump, and Our Nation at Risk, Election Integrity as a National Security Issue, co-authored with Julian Zelizer. Welcome to Background Briefing, Karen Greenberg.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thanks for joining us. And Donald Trump is telling us that we're closer to peace between Ukraine and Russia than we have ever been. The negotiations underway in Berlin, hosted by the German Chancellor, involving Zelensky and Witkoff and Jared Kushner. According to Ursula von der Leyen of the EU, she says that there's real progress being made. Zelensky has said that Ukraine is prepared to give up its hopes to join NATO if there's some sort of security guarantees. There's obviously an awful lot to be worked out in the fine print, but nevertheless, as I say, President Trump's already, I think, writing his Nobel Prize speech. But then you throwing cold water on all of this is the head of Britain's MI6, its Foreign Intelligence Service, and the new head, first time ever, a woman, Blaise Mitterrand, is pretty much saying no. Putin is just dragging out these peace talks. He's stringing us along, and he wants what he's always wanted, which is to subjugate Ukraine. So what are you hearing in terms of spy talk?
I just think in terms of, not in terms of what I know about spying, but what I think is that those two things, even though they sound contradictory, are not mutually exclusive, which is that very well seems to be and has been Putin's strategy to just drag this out, unless he gets the territory that he wants. And who knows how much of that it is, right, that he would be willing to settle for. And the other is that there is a way in which negotiations are afoot from other nations and other places, so that Zelensky will back down from some of his demands, for example, joining NATO. So in other words, it's the push and the pull of this. But right now, this push and pull is not seeming to be in the direction of Zelensky. And I think that's what she was trying to convey in terms of a sense of urgency, of understanding, just where we are, and not just Putin's making this continue into the, just drag on and on and on, but also that this unwillingness to step back has really proven somewhat effective. But we'll see.
But the new head of Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service, MI6, first of all, she's the first woman to ever head this
Yes.
service. And as we've seen from the Jean le Carré books, how sort of chauvinistic it all is. And it's pretty surprising that this 48-year-old Blaise Metrowell, who comes out of the Q section, which is what the James Bond movies is always the guy with all the gadgets and stuff.
Yeah.
She was the head of that. So she apparently invited the press, which is a huge no-no for most spy services, and particularly the British one. They feed stuff to the press, but they don't want to. They don't open their doors. And in her case, she opened up the private dining room, to all the press, and overlooking the Thames River, and spoke pretty openly, and it's pretty unusual. So what do you think's motivating her? Is she genuinely concerned, as most Europeans appear to be, that Putin's on the move?
I think so, but I think the speech itself wasn't just about Putin. I mean, I just want to tell you, I found the speech extraordinary and unusual in a lot of ways. And I think it spoke, I think the direction at Putin the part directed at Putin was also it was also in the context of what we saw this past week, in the issuing of the national security strategy in the United States, which I think surprised many of us on many different levels. But one of the ways it was surprising, perhaps to some, was the way in which it refused to focus on Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war, and to try to say that, we need to push Putin in the direction of finding some kind of resolution. It was very, very much withdrawn from that kind of narrative. And it was also extremely harsh on Europe and pulling back from Europe. And I think that this speech, in that context, she doesn't talk just about MI6. She does talk about the coalitions and the organizations that are part of Europe in its security strategy, be it NATO, the EU, etc. And so she's very interested in the European picture. And so I really do think that this speech definitely has to be seen within the context of the just released national security strategy of the United States. And when you talk about technology, yes, she is very clear about how she understands the transformations in warfare that have happened, and how they've played out, for example, in the context of Russia and Ukraine. And she is talking about the ways in which technologies have increased the challenges that intelligence services and militaries have to face when it comes to operating in the world we're in. But the thread of her speech is not about technology. The thread of her speech is about how we have to re-envision the human element of our relations with one another, our way of doing intelligence gathering, our way of understanding what's at stake, and how to think about warfare, even as the technological advances have completely changed our understanding of war. And as she says, I'm not quoting exactly because I don't have the quote, but yeah, she says, we are all on the front lines of war because of those technological advances. And so I would encourage everybody to read this speech, by the way. It's rather extraordinary, not just because of her convening this, the head of an intelligence service convening folks in her dining room, but also for the head of intelligence service to make a speech, and in fact, this kind of speech at this moment in time.
Well, but the Brits have suffered from Russian hybrid attacks, right?
Yeah. She mentions a number of things, whether it's Brits or others. She mentions, the cyber attack. She talks about drone attacks. She really, she knows her stuff in this domain very, very well, as you pointed out. This is something that, she's has an expertise in. And so it's yeah. So yes.
Right. Well, I'm going back to the polonium poisoning of Litvinenko, the poisoning of Skripal, and the ongoing, hybrid warfare stuff that's going on all across Europe.
And also in the seas as well, right, which she points out. Yes.
She says above and below the waves.
Yeah.
So But let's talk about the national security strategy document that came out last week. The classified version of it, which has been leaked to Defense One, indicates that Trump wants to abandon the G7, the democratic nations. It used to be the G8, and they kicked Russia out because of its rolling back democracy. He wants to form what he calls the C5, the core five, which is Russia, China, India, Japan, and the United States. Countries with a lot of territory and in case of Japan, a lot of wealth. So the Europeans have got to be feeling that, the core of NATO no longer exists. I mean, they must realize that they're being hung out to dry with this president. And why do you think he hates them? We know, well, we don't know why J.D. Vance hates them. We sure as hell know that he does. I'm absolutely mystified. Why does he hate Europe, hate NATO, and love Putin?
Well, I think that requires a longer conversation, and I don't know all of the reasons for it. But look, the world order, as we know, is shifting tremendously towards a different kind of geopolitical structure. And experts and politicians have been talking about this, in recent years. And what Trump is actually saying is, look, I want to be with those who have the most power. And that power includes, oil, it includes money, it includes potentials for other kinds of deals, that we've seen him make. And that's where he wants to land. That's where he wants to be. And Europe is not useful anymore. What's interesting about the national security strategy is the way in which they attempt to portray Europe as an impediment to the spread of democracy. It's like turning things on its head of what we've usually understand the transatlantic alliance to be. And so it's really that I think Europe is not useful in a way that they see. But it also, interacts with where the United States has been slow to help in the situation of Ukraine, which is the threat to Ukraine is seen in the larger vision, hence the NATO component, as a potential threat to Europe and to some countries of Europe more immediately than others, but as a threat to Europe and as a threat to the idea of NATO, depending on what happens. And it's just not something that Trump wants to impede in terms of that threat. He just doesn't see the value of Europe. Doesn't command the same kind of power structure that he very much adheres to, whether it's with Middle Eastern nations or with Russia, or as we've seen in recent days with some developments with China.
But do you think Trump, because he and Miller are so hostile to the political left, he calls the Democratic Party, they both do, a bunch of communists and radicals at every turn, and I think some of our listeners probably wish they were more radical and more to the left, but it just is not the case. So given that this national security strategy document basically says we've got to be nice to these far-right neo-Nazi and fascist parties in Europe, like the AfD in Germany, and in effect, we should be more racist. They should be more racist, like we are. We're rounding up all of the brown people. They should be rounding up all the Muslims and expelling them from Europe. I mean, I'm not quoting from the document accurately, but I think I'm paraphrasing what the intent of it was.
Yeah, I mean, it's in a way, does this really surprise you? In terms of what we've seen, in terms of policy, who the country has reached out to, who the administration has tried to form alliances with, how the administration has treated migrants, asylum seekers, and others at the southern border generally, what they've done to the temporary protected status program for people coming to the United States. So, I mean, that part of it, I don't really find very surprising. And having, whether it's applied to Europe or stated here, yeah.
And on top of that, of course, the leaders that Trump celebrates and keeps telling us how widely respected they are people like Orban, Bolsonaro, and Erdogan.
Yeah, but this is not news. This is
Right.
not new. And
No.
it fits into the same idea of strong men who are willing to, in their minds, reinstitute an order that has long since passed. And I also find that is what coalesces with for example, the use of the word communist, which what does that even mean in today's day and age, right? It meant one thing at a place and time many years ago, and now all of a sudden trying to be revived. It's just sort of confounding, and yeah.
Well, Stephen Miller, who's the sort of dark whisperer, the co-president, as many have suggested, it's likely that he will have even more influence if Susie Wiles gets sidelined because of the revelations in the interview that she did in Vanity
Yeah.
Fair, which I'm sure has annoyed Trump. Whether he may not want to fire her, but he may want to sideline her
Well, it is
because
kind of interesting to see that sort of they're sort of backing up her as somebody they're not going to fire. They don't want to push aside. They're accusing Vanity Fair of leaving out portions of the interview that would have made it appear a little bit differently. They've tried to both cast doubt on what was reported in the article, and at the same time to say they're not going to take the bait, they're not going to fire her, they're not going to stop supporting her, they admire her, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you've seen all of these statements that have been made. So it remains to be seen where this is going to be headed. But I do want to say, I thought it was an extraordinary article and extraordinarily revealing.
well, Chris Whipple has all the tapes. It's,
Yeah.
it's not like they're not making anything up.
Hmm.
It's all absolutely
No.
verified. So
Right.
she did say what she said, and she said that, because her father, Pat Summerall, was an alcoholic, that Trump, he has an alcoholic personality, even though he doesn't drink. And I think the most damning thing of all was J.D. Vance is a conspiracy theorist. And furthermore, his conversion from being a Trump critic to a sycophant is not a genuine one. It's just political.
Yeah.
That's pretty devastating. I mean, not news, as you said. It's not
Right.
news, but boy, is that a bombshell?
What is news is where this is headed. I think, is it really just going to be a story that goes away for the moment because the administration has made the decision that they're not going to get in this fight, that they think it's not a good idea and they're just going to cast doubt on it? Or, is something else going to happen? Is she going to be at some point forced out? And what will that mean in terms of what comes down from her in the future? And if any kind of fissure that it causes within the MAGA stronghold.
Well, Karen, I thank you for joining us. We're out of time, but I appreciate you joining us here today.
It's always a pleasure, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Karen Greenberg, who's an International Studies Fellow at the New America Foundation and a Fellow at New York University Law School's Reese Center for Security and a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the co-host of the Spy Talk podcast. She's the author of Rogue Justice, The Making of the Security State, Subtle Tools, The Dismantling of American Democracy from the War on Terror to Donald Trump, and Our Nation at Risk, Election Integrity as a National Security Issue, co-authored with Julian Zelizer. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with the educator Henry Giroux about higher education in the time of fascist plague.
From Russia with love, I fly to you, much wiser since my goodbye to you. I've traveled the world to...
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Henry Giroux, a renowned educator, author, and cultural critic who holds the chair for scholarship in the public interest in English and cultural studies at McMaster University in Canada. His recent books include Insurrections, Education in the Age of Counter-Revolutionary Politics, Fascism on Trial, Education and the Possibility of Democracy, and his latest book is The Burden of Conscience, Educating Beyond the Veil of Silence. And he has a recent article at Counterpunch, Higher Education in the Time of Fascist Plague. Welcome to Background Briefing, Henry Giroux.
Oh, it's always a pleasure.
Well, thanks for joining us, Henry. And when you talk about the fascist plague, it's a global situation, surely, because essentially what we have now, particularly in Trump, Xi Jinping, and Putin, a kind of group of mafia bosses that want to carve up the world into territories where Trump gets the Western Hemisphere, Xi gets Asia, and Putin gets Russia and Eastern Europe. And that's the kind of world Trump wants. And now we're learning from the classified version of his recently released national security strategy that he envisions getting rid of the G7 of democratic nations and joining a new group that he wants to form called the Core Five, which is the United States, Russia, China, India, and Japan. In other words, countries that have a lot of territory and a lot of money, and which is what Trump is all about. So given the nature of those countries, they're either fascist or authoritarian, and Trump, of course, is a wannabe authoritarian and fascist. Can you make the case that what you're talking about here is a global problem?
Yeah, of course it's a global problem. I mean, and we're not just talking about this alignment of specific dictators, to carve up the world in the way that we saw in The Godfather. Those mafia types meeting in Cuba to carve up Cuba. We're really talking about a kind of neoliberal capitalism that in some way shares certain elements that they all share as authoritarian governments. I mean, they all share in the repression of dissent. There certainly is a confluence among some of them around the question of racial cleansing, to say the very least. There's an attack on the very notion of democracy as a viable political system globally and nationally. And there's an attempt to basically consolidate the power of a kind of financial elite that take different forms in different countries. But my biggest concern is really about how this level of dictatorship, these dictatorships at the level of everyday life get normalized, and how we can talk about not just simply economic systems in the pursuit of concentrated amounts of wealth and power, but how basically they begin to normalize a certain set of categories that are really utterly anti-democratic and antithetical to any possible notion of national or international globalism, democracy.
So I guess that explains why billionaires, particularly the Silicon Valley oligarchs, how they're completely mobile, where Elon Musk, for example, has Xi Jinping on his speed dial, he has Putin on his speed dial, and now that he's made up with Trump, he has Trump on his speed dial.
Well, I think that one of the things you want to try to understand, and my friend Zygmunt Bauman wrote about this 20 years ago, power is global, and politics is local. Meaning that these oligarchs have no allegiance to nation states. I mean, basically, they operate in a realm of power now that in many ways is about where's the best place to get resources and to consolidate power and to use the apparatuses, the new apparatuses, of whether they're technology or otherwise, to really consolidate power on a global level. I mean, what we're seeing is the emergence of a billionaire class that operates in such a way that it's utterly concerned about three things. It's concerned about garnishing resources that are going to be absolutely imperative in the new technological economic age. It's about racial cleansing, and it's about four things. And it's about racial cleansing, it's about crushing of dissent, and it's about eliminating those institutions in the public realm in all of these countries that in some way offer a threat to the mindset that informs various forms of authoritarianism.
So, Henry, obviously your article as an educator is about, it's titled Higher Education in the Time of Fascist Plague. But let me just read the second to last paragraph, because I think it's extremely cogent and eloquent. As authoritarianism weaponizes ignorance, as cruelty becomes a governing principle, and as whole populations are written off the category of the human, the struggle for the future falls squarely on the shoulders of educators and cultural workers. Our task is nothing less than to disrupt the pedagogy of fascism, to nurture forms of critical memory that cannot be erased, solidarities that cannot be bought off, imaginations that refuse to be colonized. If we fail, the future will be engineered by those who thrive on amnesia and revel in disposability. But if we rise to the challenge, insisting on truth, defending the vulnerable, and widening the moral vocabulary of democracy, we create the conditions under which new generations can breathe, speak, and begin again. Resistance, then, is not an option. It is the only means by which the future survives. Bravo. I think you nailed it.
I think in that paragraph, is obviously Ian trying to say a couple of things. And one is that the fight against fascism is not just simply around disrupting and reformulating and eliminating certain kinds of global economic structures. It basically is also about developing the vocabulary, the analysis, the modes of understanding, a consciousness that in many ways suggests that what's at stake is not just the colonizing of economic resources, but the colonizing of minds. I mean, remember, the first casualty of authoritarianism are the minds that would oppose it. And this is not just a political issue. It's also a pedagogical and an educational issue. And I think this question of consciousness, this question of pedagogy, this questions of how we understand the truth, this question of how people learn to think systemically, but even more importantly, how they learn to think historically. I mean, one of the things that I find enormously disturbing about much of discourse, particularly in the United States, if not in some other places, less so in Europe, is the inability to draw parallels, the inability to really learn from history, the inability to say, hey, look, we've seen racial capitalism and fascism before. One could argue that it began with the KKK. I mean, we failed to realize that Hitler modeled his eugenicist program on the research going on in the United States. We fail to realize that this attack on universities has been done before. We fail to realize that when you demonize an entire group of people and engage in forms of racial cleansing, if you look back in history, there's an endpoint for that. That endpoint is the camps. I mean, it seems to me utterly improbable to talk and watch and to look at and to understand the Gestapo that's at work under the name of ICE in the United States with their ruthlessness, their refusal to engage in due process. They're abducting people, they're beating people up, they're arresting citizens, they're shipping them off, and at the same time, the prison industrial complex is expanding as one of the great profitable economies of the time. And we can't look at history and understand what that means. If we don't do that, we don't have categories. We don't have an endpoint. We don't have a sense of where the future goes. We have to ask ourselves, what kind of cultures emerge that cancel out the future? What kind of cultures emerge that colonize the mind in such a way that the cruelty, the suffering, the exploitation, the concentration of wealth in relatively few hands becomes enormously normalized? How does normalization is a form of depoliticization, and the fight against that begins in education. You make visible how power works. You make visible how the economy, through massive and staggering levels of inequality, disempower people. You make visible how people who are anxious and have to are losing their health care, that what alternatives that they have are not to look to the cult, to the supreme figure, but to mobilize. To get unions to mobilize, to get workers to mobilize, to get these institutions like higher education to be able to work together with other social movements to say, hey, look, it isn't one institution that's under threat. Everything's under threat. We don't live any longer in a kind of, how do you say it, half-baked democracy where some institutions are working. We now live in a country, a fascist state, in which all institutions are under siege. They're all under siege. You mentioned the national security protocol that has just come out with, what is the exact numbers? The NSPF
Yeah.
-7. unbelievable. I mean, this is worse than what we saw under Bush. I mean, they're saying things like not only is to be is dissent comparable to treason, but we are going to round up and basically imprison people who suggest that they might be a threat. I mean, this is like pre-crime. This is like the film, was it Minority of One?
Minority Report.
The Minority Report. I mean, so what we're seeing are the theoretical, political, and educational foundations of something that, to say the least, is very terrifying. And that's what I tried to write about in this piece. And I tried to argue that higher education, I don't want to be nostalgic about higher education. It's never truly been a place where, democracy and free speech thrive. We know that. But it had the promise of those ideals. And it often attempted to hide what it did by appealing to those ideals. Well, those ideals aren't even appealed to anymore. Even the ideals are now a threat. And I think that's something we need to take very seriously.
Well, Henry, it used to be free, but now we're indenturing our young people with student debt. I mean, that's the most disgusting turn of events.
No, that's absolutely insightful. You bet. I mean, not only do we colonize minds, we now colonize bodies, because all of a sudden they find themselves in such debt that they could never go into public service. And basically, they're indentured to banks. They're indentured to private corporations. And then we see the way in which billionaires who basically are profiting from this stuff are now actively shaping curriculum in schools and in universities in ways that are far worse than the McCarthy period. I mean, in Texas A&M, among other states, has argued that all syllabuses have to be reviewed annually. They're looking for words like critical race theory, racism, terms that they feel that in some way disrupt the authoritarian mind. These schools, there was a place when we talked about higher education as simply being wedded to the market. It was an adjunct to corporations. Now they've been transformed from that into basically nothing more than laboratories for right-wing indoctrination, educating people into what it means to hold positions that justify racial cleansing and state violence. I mean, my concern is not just simply that we're creating new institutions to create fascist subjects. My concern is that the notion of violence has become so widespread that politics is now an extension of violence, and education is an extension for basically, in some way, legitimating that.
Well, Henry, when you talk about the erasure of history, that's what the right wing are doing in this country, because they are arguing that if you tell the truth about the genocide of the Native Americans and slavery, you are hurting the delicate young minds of white children, when in fact the Civil War is something that everybody should face and recognize what happened. It was the most horrendous thing that ever happened in this country. Still to this day, it is where the highest casualties in any American war ever fought. It was a monstrous situation where the right side won, and the wrong side is trying to rehabilitate itself with its rewriting history about honor when they were a bunch of traitors.
Let's be honest about this. We're talking about a couple of things here. One, we're talking about a subversion of the truth, a kind of self-sabotaging of the truth, which seems to suggest that the search for truth is really about the search for making people comfortable. Well, I'm sorry. Searching for the truth is not about being comfortable. It's about having an understanding that's critical and engaging. And if it hurts our feelings, too bad. It seems to me that what do you say about black students who all of a sudden are being told that slavery wasn't really all that bad? Do their feelings get hurt? But the whole question of feelings is irrelevant. That's just basically a way of legitimating idiocy. But I think the other side of this is that the way in which history is being rewritten is really interesting, because it's not just being rewritten in ways in which domination seems to be legitimated in particular kinds of celebrations. It's being rewritten in the name of white supremacy. I mean, we're talking about resurrecting the Confederacy. We're talking about eliminating all those people who fought over civil rights for 100 years. We're talking about battleships being named. Are you ready? In the name of basically people who were traitors, who argued for slavery. We're talking about military bases being renamed. The names reverting back to Confederate generals. Couple that with the attempt to completely eliminate the history of racism in the United States, or to eliminate from the national museums and other massively important educational sites any vestige of the United States that would suggest that countries emerge out of struggles. Those struggles have to be understood. They have to be interrogated for very simple reasons, so they don't be repeated. I mean, I guess that what we're seeing here is not simply the elimination of history, but the rewriting of history in the interest of legitimating particular forms of domination. Again, slavery, racial cleansing, ethnic cleansing, state violence. This is history being written, and I don't want to be too melodramatic here, but this is history being rewritten in the interest of state terrorism. You know, we're not just dealing with a fascist regime or one that mimics elements of fascism. This is state terrorism. This is a government that basically is promoting violence against its own people. That sounds like state terrorism to me in terms of a definition. And all you have to do is look at what's went on in Chicago, what went on in Los Angeles, what's going on with abductions, what's going on with the elimination of democratic institutions, what's going on with the violation of the Constitution itself, and what's going on with billionaires buying the media. So that basically all vestiges of critical thought in those critical places that matter are being snuffed out. Then couple that with the utter personal corruption that's going on in Trump's administration. I mean, the corruption is unreal, just open, flagrant, and basically a way to simply say, we don't care, that this is a criminogenic institution. We're going to say we're fighting drug wars in Venezuela, while at the same time Trump pardons one of the biggest drug lords ever convicted from Honduras. I mean, the contradictions are overwhelming, and you can't get through this unless you examine these contradictions with a language that exposes them and makes the visceral nature of power visible. I mean, I really stress that visible. You need a notion of historical consciousness. You need a notion of comprehensibility, meaning you have to be able to put all these different elements together. And thirdly, you need to ask yourself, what is it going to take to fight this? And not in terms of individual skirmishes, but in terms of mass movements and direct action.
Well, Henry Giroux, I'm afraid we ran out of time, but I appreciate you joining us here today.
Oh, thank you, Ian. I hope this helps.
It does indeed, and I'm glad we spoke. And I've been speaking with Henry Giroux, who's a renowned educator, author, and cultural critic who holds a chair in scholarship in the public interest in English and cultural studies at McMaster University in Canada. His recent books include Insurrections, Education in the Age of Counter-Revolutionary Politics, Fascism on Trial, Education and the Possibility of Democracy, and his latest book is The Burden of Conscience, Educating Beyond the Veil of Silence. And he has a recent article at Counterpunch, Higher Education in the Time of Fascist Plague. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.